If your father served in the Pacific, he probably never told you about this day. 6 minutes. That is how long it took. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, 3 of the finest warships in the Imperial Japanese Navy were destroyed in the span of a single cigarette. A fourth would follow before night. 248 aircraft, 3,000 men, and every plan the Empire of Japan had made for the Pacific War gone before lunch. The American pilots who did it were boys. Farm boys from Iowa, bank clerks from Pennsylvania, boys who had never seen a Japanese sailor except through a bomb sight. And the Japanese admirals who watched it happen, Nagumo, Yamaguchi, Yamamoto, spent the next 3 years trying to find the words. Some of them never did. One of them shot himself in a cave on a Pacific island. One of them took 11 young men into the sky 4 hours after his own emperor had surrendered. This is what they said. This is what they could not say. And this is why, when your grandfather came home from the Pacific, he did not talk about it either. This is the story of the day the Japanese Navy watched itself burn, told in the words of the men who were there. The sun rose over calm water. On the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi stood a man of 55 years, short, thick-set, his face weathered by 3 decades at sea. His name was Chuichi Nagumo, Vice Admiral, commander of the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force of 4 fleet carriers that had ruled the Pacific for 6 months. He did not look like a man about to lose. Behind him, the controlled chaos of a carrier at combat stations unfolded across the deck. Handlers guided returning aircraft into parking positions. Ordnance crews rolled bombs and torpedoes on wheeled carts, their boots hammering against steel. Pilots climbed down from their cockpits, still wearing flight suits stained with sweat and gun. To the north, 3 other carriers steamed in formation. Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Together they carried 248 aircraft. Together they had never been defeated. It was 7:28 in the morning, June 4th, 1942. A radio operator stepped forward and handed Nagumo a message slip. The paper was thin, the characters typed in precise strokes. 10 ships, apparently enemy sighted, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo read it once, then again. Officers nearby later remembered that his face did not change. It simply became still, as if his mind had turned inward and closed a door behind it. 10 ships. He looked up from the paper. The bridge fell quiet around him. "Where?" he said softly. "Are there carriers?" No one answered, because no one knew. The scout that had sent the report was a float plane launched from the cruiser Tone. It had lifted off late that morning, delayed by a catapult malfunction, half an hour late, perhaps more. The pilot had reported ships. He had not reported types. Cruisers, destroyers, or something worse. Nagumo turned to his operations officer. His voice was quiet even. "Signal the scout. Identify ship types. Maintain contact." Below on the flight deck, a young pilot climbed down from his aircraft. Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga. He had led the strike against Midway that morning, 108 aircraft attacking the American installations on the island for more than half an hour. Still in his flight suit, still smelling of aviation gasoline, he delivered his assessment to the air operations staff. A second strike was required. The enemy installations remained operational. The words traveled up to the bridge, and with them, the first mistake began to take shape. When Tomonaga's strike had launched before dawn, Nagumo had held back a reserve force, 93 aircraft, torpedoes slung beneath their belt, armor-piercing bombs locked into their racks, weapons designed to sink ships. This was standard doctrine. A carrier commander kept half his strength ready for the enemy fleet, always. But the enemy fleet had not appeared. Only Midway, only shore installations, only the ineffective, uncoordinated attacks of American aircraft from the island itself, high-altitude bombers missing wildly, torpedo planes shot down in flames. So Nagumo had made a decision. At 7:15 that morning, 13 minutes before the message from Tone's scout arrived, he had ordered the reserve rearm. Torpedoes off, land bombs on. Prepare a second strike against Midway. On the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, ordnance crews were already at work. Torpedoes being unbolted from aircraft rolled away on carts. Land bombs brought up from the magazines below. It was slow, precise labor. It required space, time, coordination. And now, somewhere 240 miles away, there were 10 enemy ships. Deep in a cabin below the bridge, another officer lay in his bunk, Commander Minoru Genda, 37 years old, the gifted air planner who had designed the Pearl Harbor attack, the mind behind Kido Butai's every operation. His forehead was burning with fever. He had been sick for days, but had refused to be left behind in Japan. When staff officers came to tell him about the sighting, he pushed himself up on his elbow. His face was flushed. His voice was strained. What types? Unknown, Commander. The scout is maintaining contact. Genda closed his eyes for a long moment. If there are carriers, we must launch at once, even if only the ready aircraft can go. But Genda was not on the bridge. He was in a bunk, shaking with fever. And down in the sick bay, another man could not help either. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, 39 years old, the pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, who had cried the code words Tora, Tora, Tora into his radio 6 months earlier, lay recovering from an emergency appendectomy performed the day before. He would come to the bridge later that morning. He would watch. He would not fly. He would not command. Two of the finest minds in Japanese naval aviation were aboard Akagi that morning. Neither could speak into Nagumo's ear at the moment he needed them most. Nagumo waited. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. The bridge remained quiet. Akagi's deck filled with returning aircraft from the Midway strike. Deck crews pushed them aside, cleared space, refueled hoses running like arteries across the steel. Strike could not be launched with a deck full of landing aircraft. Doctrine was clear. Recovery had to be completed first. Then a second message arrived from the scout. 7:45. The enemy force was composed of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief crossed Nagumo's face. Visible relief. Officers on the bridge saw cruisers and destroyers, not carriers. Surface group probably sent to intercept the invasion convoy heading for Midway. Manageable. Predictable. Exactly the kind of target his torpedo aircraft were designed to destroy. Except those aircraft were no longer armed with torpedoes. Nagumo turned to his staff. His voice was firm now, decisive. Rearm with torpedo. Prepare to attack the enemy surface force after recovery of the Midway strike. The order traveled down. On the hangar decks, ordnance crews stopped what they were doing. The land bombs they had just spent 30 minutes loading were pulled back off the aircraft. Torpedoes, which had been rolled away only an hour earlier, were now brought back. Elevators moved. Carts rattled. Men shouted. Sweat ran down their faces in the closed, oil-thick air of the hangar. There was no time to return the land bombs properly to the magazines deep inside the ships. No time for the careful ballet of ordnance handling that peacetime doctrine required. Bombs were stacked against bulkheads wherever there was space. Torpedoes lay beside them. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck. Aviation gasoline pooled in the corners, its vapor filling the closed compartments with a sweet, dangerous smell. Above on the bridge, Nagumo saw none of this. He saw only the sun rising over calm water. He saw only his carriers steaming together in formation. He saw only what he had always seen, a fleet that had never been defeated. Then at 8:19, a third message arrived. The scout aircraft had continued its patrol. Now it reported that the enemy force was accompanied by what appeared to be a carrier. Appears to be, not confirmed. Nagumo stared at the paper in his hand. Around him, the bridge fell silent again. The kind of silence that has weight. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding officer of Akagi, stepped closer to his admiral. His voice was careful. Admiral, if there is a carrier present, we should launch immediately. Nagumo looked up. With what? Half our aircraft are still returning. They must land. The other half are being rearmed. The decks are full. He gestured through the bridge windows. Down on the deck, the disorder was visible. Aircraft crowded fore and aft, deck handlers running between them. Fuel hoses coiled everywhere. It was not chaos. It was the ordinary chaos of a carrier at work. But it meant a strike could not launch immediately. Not without abandoning the aircraft still in the air. Not without sending pilots up in ones and twos, uncoordinated, unescorted, vulnerable. We launch a partial strike with whatever is ready, or we wait 1 hour. Recover all aircraft. Complete the rearming. Launch a full coordinated strike. The words hung in the air. This was the decision that would shape everything that followed. Everything. Across the water on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, another admiral watched the same situation unfold and reached a very different conclusion. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, 50 years old, a graduate of Princeton University, known throughout the fleet for his aggressiveness, his willingness to gamble, his conviction that hesitation in battle was worse than. He signaled Nagumo by lamp. The message was brief. 3 words in essence: launch attack force. Nagumo read it on his bridge. He considered it, and he made his choice. Wait, recover all aircraft, complete the rearming, then launch a full coordinated strike. It was what his 30 years in the Navy told him was correct. It was what a careful, methodical commander did. Nagumo was a careful, methodical commander. He had spent his entire career avoiding errors rather than gambling on bold moves. He had risen through the ranks not by brilliance but by seniority. He had been given command of the Kido Butai not because he understood carrier aviation, not because he understood the machine of interlocking radios and fuel lines and elevator cycles that a modern carrier had become, but because it was his turn, because tradition demanded it, because the Imperial Japanese Navy assigned commands by lineage, not by talent, and this was the truth that no one on Akagi's bridge would say aloud that morning. The man commanding the most powerful carrier force in the world was a torpedo specialist, a surface warfare officer. He had never flown an aircraft. He had never trained as a naval agent. He did not, at a deep instinctive level, understand what a carrier could and could not do in the 90 seconds between a warning and a bomb. The two men who did understand were on his ship. One was burning with fever in a bunk below. The other was recovering from surgery in the sick bay. They could not save him. So the Kido Butai waited. The last of Tomonaga's midway strike aircraft touched down at 8:30. His own plane came in last, fuel leaking from a ruptured tank, a thin trail of vapor streaming behind him. Deck crews rushed forward to push the aircraft into parking positions. Refueling teams uncoiled their hoses. Below in the hangars, the ordnance crews continued. Bombs off. Torpedoes on. Bombs stacked. Torpedoes waiting. The four carriers moved steadily through the calm sea. Their decks were crowded. Their hangars were full of weapons that should have been locked away. Their crews were working at maximum speed to prepare for a strike they now knew would be against American carriers. Somewhere over the horizon, those American carriers were doing the same. But the Americans were not doing the same at all. The Americans knew exactly where Kido Butai was. They had known for days. They had read Nagumo's mail. Cryptographers in a windowless basement in Pearl Harbor had broken the Japanese naval code and reconstructed the American carriers had been positioned northeast of Midway 3 days earlier and had been waiting there, silent, patient, listening on the radio for the first Japanese launch. Nagumo did not know this. He could not know this. He believed, as every man on his bridge believed, that surprise was still on his side. At 9:18, the first American aircraft appeared on the horizon. They were not dive bombers. They were torpedo planes, slow, obsolete, flying low above. 15 Douglas Devastators from the carrier Hornet, approaching from the east in loose formation. The combat air patrol above Kido Butai saw them and dove. Zero fighters, the finest fighter aircraft in the world in 1942, fell upon the American planes like wolves upon lambs. What followed was a slaughter. The Devastators pressed forward through walls of anti-aircraft fire. Their pilots knew what they were flying in. They came anyway. They released their torpedoes at too great a distance. Every torpedo missed. Every single one of the 15 aircraft in Torpedo Squadron 8 was shot down. Every one. One American torpedo pilot survived Midway. His name was Ensign George Gay. He was 25 years old from Waco, Texas. He had flown a Douglas Devastator off the carrier Hornet that morning with 29 other men in Torpedo Squadron 8. 29 of them were shot down and killed. Gay was the 30th. His aircraft was hit. His radioman was dead behind him. He put the plane in the water within sight of the Japanese fleet, climbed out onto the wing, and grabbed a floating seat cushion as the aircraft sank beneath him. He spent the next 30 hours. He hid under the seat cushion because Japanese ships were passing within a few hundred yards. And from the water, floating alone in the Pacific, Ensign George Gay of Waco, Texas, watched the entire battle happen above him. He watched Akagi, he watched Kaga, he watched Soryu. He was the only American who saw it happen from close enough to hear the men scream. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo watched the torpedo attacks with a grim, quiet sound. American torpedo planes. Poor coordination. Ineffective. He was correct. In that narrow moment, he was correct. But the torpedo attacks did not stop. At 9:25, 14 more Devastators appeared, this time from the carrier Enterprise. 10 were destroyed. Their torpedoes missed. At 9:35, 12 more arrived from Yorktown. The pattern repeated itself, brave, doomed, futile, and each attack pulled the Japanese fighters low and lower, down to wave height, down to the water, where the American torpedo planes were dying in flames. Every gun on every ship focused on the low-altitude threat. Every pair of eyes looked down. No one was looking. High above Kido Butai, at 14,000 feet, In the thin, cold air of the upper atmosphere, 33 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise were rolling in. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour. His fuel was running low. He had been minutes from turning back. Then he had seen it. A single Japanese destroyer, racing northeast at high speed, cutting a white wake through the blue Pacific. Its name was Arashi. It had fallen behind the fleet, dropping depth charges on an American submarine named Nautilus, and now it was hurrying to catch. McCluskey had followed it, straight to Kido Butai. At the same moment, in almost identical circumstances, 17 more Dauntlesses from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie were rolling into position above the carrier Soryu. The Japanese did not see them, not yet. A lookout on Akagi's bridge screamed. The word was not a report. It was a cry, half strangled, torn out of a throat that had suddenly recognized what its eyes were seeing. Dive bombers. Nagumo turned. He looked up, and there, plunging out of the morning sun, he saw dark shapes falling toward him at a speed the human mind cannot easily process. They grew larger by the second, from specks to crosses to air to individual rivets on the noses of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers screaming down through the sky at 400 miles. Nagumo said in that moment was never written down. No officer thought to record it. There was no time. The bridge erupted into sound. Orders shouted, boots hammering steel, a voice through the intercom calling for hard rudder. Akagi began to turn, her massive hull heeling slightly as she came around, too slowly. One bomb struck amidship, punched down through the flight deck as if the steel were paper. It penetrated deep into the upper hangar, into the space where crews had been rearming aircraft for the past 2 hours, into the space where torpedoes lay stacked against bulkheads, where land bombs sat waiting on cargo, where fuel lines snaked across the floor and aviation gasoline pooled in the corner. It detonated. A second bomb exploded just off the stern, jamming her rudder. It was enough. For a moment, from the bridge, nothing seemed to happen. A shudder. A muffled roar from below, smoke curling up through the elevator shafts, then the hangar deck erupted. The bombs and torpedoes that Nagumo had ordered rearmed twice, that had been stacked wherever there was space because there was no time to store them properly, began to cook. Secondary explosions, then tertiary, then a chain of detonations that traveled the length of the ship. Aviation fuel ignited, aircraft ignited, bulkheads buckled outward, fire poured up through every opening in the deck like breath from a furnace. An officer stumbled onto the bridge. His face was black with soot. His uniform was torn. Hangar deck on fire, multiple fire main pressure failing. Before Nagumo could answer, another cry from the lookout. 1,000 yards to starboard, 4 columns of water rose around the carrier Kaga. Then bombs struck her. 4 direct hits in quick succession. Her flight deck vanished beneath a wall of flame. Her bridge disappeared into black smoke. Her captain and every officer standing beside him were killed in a single instant. Beyond Kaga, the third carrier, Soryu, smaller, faster, maneuvering desperately. 3 bombs from Leslie's Yorktown Dauntlesses struck her in rapid sequence. Her flight deck tore open like paper. Fire poured from her hangars. 3 carriers, struck in 6 minutes. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo stood without movement. The deck tilted slightly beneath his feet. Smoke crept in through the open window. Outside, across the water, he could see Kaga burning. He could see Soryu burning. He could feel his own ship burning beneath him. An officer grabbed his arm. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. The ship is lost." Nagumo did not answer immediately. "Lost," he finally said, as if the word had no meaning. Captain Taijiro Aoki appeared beside him. His uniform torn, his face grim, his voice carried the calm authority of a man who has already accepted that he will die. "Admiral, I request permission to remain with the ship. You must transfer to a cruiser and continue directing the battle." The battle. Nagumo looked at Aoki. Then he looked out across the water at the burning wrecks of 3/4 of his carrier. Then he looked back. "Where is Hiryu?" "Hiryu is undamaged, Admiral. She was separated from the main formation. The Americans did not find her. 1 carrier left. Signal Hiryu. She is to launch all available aircraft. She is to strike the American carrier." At 10:28 in the morning, just 6 minutes after the first bomb struck, Chuichi Nagumo climbed down from the bridge of the carrier he had commanded across the Pacific for 6 months. Destroyer Nowaki pulled alongside. He crossed by rope, hand over hand, dressed in his white summer uniform, an admiral abandoning a burning ship. From the deck of Nowaki, he turned and watched Akagi burn. An officer standing near him later recalled that Nagumo said nothing for a very long time. His face carried no expression, not anger, not grief, not shock. Just a hollow quiet, as if some essential part of him had gone very far away and had not yet returned. 300 miles to the west, on the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the first reports at 11 o'clock. He was 58 years old, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his own government against war with America and then designed the attack that began. He read the message once, he read it again. He removed his glasses and folded them carefully and set them on the table. All carriers, 3 confirmed heavily damaged and burning, Admiral. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Hiryu is undamaged and preparing a counterstrike. Yamamoto did not move. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matomi Ugaki, stood beside him watching. Ugaki would later write in his private diary that in that moment Yamamoto appeared to age 10 years in 10 seconds. The face changed. Something behind the eyes withdrew. Yamamoto sat down. He spoke little for the rest of the morning. The war he had been winning for 6 months had just turned. He knew it. Ugaki knew it, but orders had to be given. Decisions had to be made. The appearance of command had to be maintained. On Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi received the news with a sharp intake of breath. 50 years old. Aggressive, a gambler, the man who just hours earlier had signaled Nagumo urging an immediate launch. 3 of his 4 carriers were burned. And on his bridge, he made the decision Nagumo had not. Launch everything. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters lifted off Hiryu's deck at 10:54. They flew east. They found the American carrier Yorktown. They struck her with 3 bombs at noon. Yamaguchi received the report on his bridge. He allowed himself a brief, tight nod. Now the torpedo struck. 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters launched at 1:30. They found Yorktown again at 2:45 in the afternoon. They struck her with 2 torpedoes. She lost power. She listed. To the Japanese pilots returning to Hiryu, she appeared to be sinking. For 1 hour, perhaps 2, it seemed possible that Hiryu alone might change the battle. 1 American carrier crippled, perhaps another still to be struck before nightfall. Then, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise appeared overhead. Yamaguchi looked up. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession. Her flight deck erupted. Her hangar filled with fire. Smoke flooded the bridge. Reports poured in. The fires could not be controlled. Yamaguchi turned to his staff. His voice was steady. All personnel will abandon ship. I will remain. His officers protested. Captain Tomeo Kaku, 49 years old, commander of Hiryu, declared that he would remain as well. Yamaguchi shook his head. The staff will transfer and continue operations. That is an order. But he would not leave. These were his ships. 3 had already burned. The 4th was burning now. He would not survive them. Yamaguchi wrote a short message that night addressed to the surviving officers of his division. I alone am responsible for the loss of Hiryu and Soryu. At 9:12 in the morning of June 5, 1942, Hiryu slipped beneath the surface of the Pacific. Yamaguchi and Kaku were still aboard. Later, in the quiet weeks that followed the battle, Japanese officers began to ask the question that would haunt the Navy for the rest of the war. How had it happened? How had 4 carriers, 4 of the finest warships in the world, been destroyed in a single day? The answer was not what most of them wanted to hear. The American bombs that struck Akagi, Kaga, Soryu were not in themselves weapons of overwhelming power. A carrier was a large ship. A single bomb, or even 2, should not have been enough to reduce her to a floating pile. The bombs had not fallen on empty steel. They had fallen on hangar decks packed with the consequences of Nagumo's 2 rearming orders. Torpedoes stacked against bulkheads because there was no time to return them to the magazines. Land bombs left on carts because they had just been pulled off air. Fuel lines uncoiled across the floor because refueling was still in progress. Aviation gasoline in open containers because the crews had been working too fast to close them. The bombs did not sink the carriers. The carrier's own ordnance sank the carriers. The Kido Butai had burned itself down, and Wade McCluskey, the American commander who had led the fatal dive, had found the Japanese fleet not by skill or by luck alone. He had found it by following the wake of a single Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, which had fallen behind the fleet chasing an American submarine and was now hurrying to catch up. She had left a white wake across the blue Pacific like a signpost. McCluskey had followed it home. The Japanese defense had drawn its own killer to the door. The Pacific War after Midway was a war of accumulation. Ships built, pilots trained, islands taken and held. For 2 long years, the Japanese Navy fought a war it could no longer win. One battle at a time, one carrier at a time, one squadron of pilots at a time. And then, in June 1944, near the Mariana Islands, the accumulation ended in a single afternoon. The Japanese commander was Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, 58 years old, tall for a Japanese officer of his generation, over 6 feet, with a thin face and a quiet voice that officers who served under him remembered as unnaturally calm. He had 9 aircraft carriers under his command. On the horizon, the American Navy waited with 15. Ozawa understood a risk. He was not a man who deceived himself. His plan, given the codename A-Go, was built on the one advantage the Japanese still possessed. The Zero fighter, stripped of armor plate, stripped of self-sealing fuel tanks, could fly farther than any American aircraft in the sky. Ozawa would launch from beyond American strike range. His pilots would attack the Americans. They would then continue west and land at Japanese airfields on Guam. The Americans, unable to reach him, would be forced to stand and take punishment. It was a good plan. On paper, on the morning of June 19, 1944, the Japanese launch began. More than 300 aircraft rose from Ozawa's decks in 4 separate ways. They flew east. American radar picked them up at more than 100 miles. The Americans were ready. American radar had matured. American fighter direction had matured. American Hellcat pilots, hundreds of them, climbed to altitude, and when the Japanese formations arrived, disorganized after the long flight, the Hellcats fell upon them in coordinated packs. American anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black bursts and, for the first time, with the new proximity fuse, a shell that did not need to hit its target to destroy. In one day, the Japanese lost more than 300 aircraft. American losses were negligible. An American pilot on the flight deck of the carrier Lexington, watching Japanese aircraft fall from the sky in numbers he had never imagined possible, remarked to a companion that it looked like an old-time turkey shoot. The name stuck. Great Marianas Turkey. The Japanese did not know yet how bad it was. Ozawa, standing on the bridge of his flagship, the new fleet carrier Taiho, was still receiving reports of successful strikes from returning pilots, most of whom had never seen the targets they claimed to have hit. He believed his aircraft had inflicted heavy damage on the Americans. He believed this for approximately 3 hours. Then, at 8:30 in the morning, an American submarine named Albacore, patrolling south of the Japanese formation, fired 6 torpedoes at Taiho. 1 struck home. The damage seemed minor. A small hole. A fuel tank ruptured. Ozawa was told the ship could continue operations. He nodded. But below decks, aviation gasoline vapor was leaking into the ship's ventilation. Junior damage control officer, panicking, ordered the ventilation fans switched on to clear the fumes. The fans spread the vapor throughout the ship. At 2:32 in the afternoon, Taiho exploded. The blast tore her open from the keel up. Flight deck buckling. Hangar disintegrating. Fire from her insides erupting through her flank. She was the newest carrier in the Japanese Navy, the most heavily armored, the pride of the fleet. She was dying. Ozawa did not want to leave her. Officers of his staff, junior men who would not normally have dared, took him by the arms and pulled him toward a waiting boat. He resisted. He said, very quietly, that he wished to remain with his ship. They pulled him harder. He was transferred to the cruiser Haguro. From Haguro, he watched Taiho burn. While Taiho was dying, another American submarine, Kavala, found the carrier Shokaku. Shokaku was one of the last 2 surviving carriers from Pearl Harbor. She had been at Pearl. She had been at Coral Sea. She had missed Midway only because her air group had been depleted the month before. Kavala fired 6 torpedoes. 3 struck home. Shokaku burned. Aviation bombs cooked off. In the early afternoon, she rolled onto her side and sank. By nightfall on the 19th of June, Ozawa was aboard a cruiser. 2 of his fleet carriers were gone. His air groups were destroyed. Of the more than 300 aircraft he had launched that morning, most were not coming back. He transferred his flag one more time to the carrier Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier of the Pearl Harbor strike. Shokaku's sister ship, the last living witness to December 7th. Standing on her bridge as the sun set, Ozawa did not speak for a long time. Later, in his written report to the post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey, he would put it more plainly than any Japanese admiral before him. After this battle, he wrote, the outcome of the war was decided. The men who had been shot down over the Philippine Sea were not cowards. They were not fools. They were young Japanese pilots who had done everything their Navy had asked of them. The problem was what their Navy had. In the years before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy had built the finest naval air arm in the world through a system of extraordinary selection and candidates were chosen with brutal care. Fewer than 1 in 10 was accepted. Those who passed spent years in training. 500 hours in the air, sometimes 700, before they were considered ready for combat. The result was a corps of pilots that had no equal in 1941. The problem was that the system could not scale. When those pilots died at Midway, at Guadalcanal, in the long, grinding air battles over the Solomons, there was no reserve to replace. The training system had been built to produce quality, not quantity, and quality took time. By 1944, the pilots Japan was sending against the American fleet had, on average, 275 hours in the air. Their American opponents had, on average, 525 hours, almost exactly twice as much. The Japanese Navy had killed itself with its own standards. Its pursuit of excellence had left it with no bench. By the time the Navy realized what it had done, the pilots at Pearl Harbor were dead. The pilots at Midway were dead. And the young men in the cockpits over the Marianas had, on average, less time in the air than an American colony. 4 months after the Philippine Sea, in October 1944, the American Navy came for the Philippines. Japan had no choice but to fight. If the Philippines fell, the oil of the Dutch East Indies would be cut off and the empire would starve. The plan was called Shogo. It was, by any honest reading, a suicide plan. Ozawa was given the northern force. 4 carriers, almost no. His job was to sail into the Pacific east of Luzon and let himself be seen. The American commander, Admiral William Halsey, the man his sailors called Bull, would come north to destroy him. That would leave the American landing beaches at Leyte Gulf uncovered. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, 55 years old, would sail through the central Philippines with a powerful surf. Yamato, her sister ship Musashi, 4 other battleships, cruisers, destroyers. Kurita would slip through the San Bernardino Strait while Halsey was gone. He would fall upon the American landing force at Leyte and destroy the transports before they could unload. Ozawa understood his role. He was the bait. He accepted the mission without complaint. On the 25th of October, the American carriers of Task Force 38 found Ozawa. Halsey, exactly as planned, sailed north with everything he had. He left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. The trap worked perfectly. American carrier aircraft descended on Ozawa's ships in wave after wave. Zuikaku was struck first by torpedoes, then by bombs. She began to list. Aboard her, the crew mustered on the sloping deck. The men were young. Many had been at Pearl Harbor as boys 3 years earlier, when Zuikaku had been young too. They stood in ranks and watched an officer lower the naval ensign, and they sang the national anthem, Kimigayo, as the sea came up to meet. Ozawa watched from another ship. He had transferred his flag the day before to a cruiser. He did not want to leave Zuikaku. He was made to. By nightfall, all 4 of his carriers were gone. He had lost every ship and the trap had worked. Halsey was gone. The San Bernardino Strait was open. Kurita, at that same moment, was in the fight of his life against a group of American ships he did not. They were called Taffy 3. 6 small escort carriers, slow, thin-skinned, designed to support amphibious landings, escorted by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. They had no business being in a battle with Yamato and her consorts. They should have been annihilated in the first 10 minutes. They were not. The American commander who charged Kurita's battleships that morning was named Ernest Evans. He was 38 years old. He was the captain of the destroyer USS Johnston. He was part Cherokee, part Creek, born in Pawnee, Oklahoma. When Johnston was commissioned 2 years earlier, Evans had stood on her deck and told his crew that this was going to be a fighting ship. He intended to go in harm's way. Anyone who did not want to go along, he said, had better get off right now. No one got off. On the morning of October 25, 1944, when the pagoda masts of the Japanese battleships appeared over the horizon, Ernest Evans turned his destroyer toward them at flank speed. He fired torpedoes. He laid smoke. He took a hit from a 14-inch shell that killed men on his bridge and wounded. He kept fighting. Took more hits. He kept fighting. When Johnston finally went down, Evans went down with her. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. His body was never recovered. He was one of the reasons Takeo Kurita turned north. He was the reason the transports at Leyte survived. And most Americans, then and now, have never heard his name. American destroyer captains up and down the line, understanding perfectly what was about to happen to the men behind them, charged Kurita's battleships at flank. American aircraft from the escort carriers, armed with whatever bombs happened to be in the racks, made attacks on the Japanese battleships with fuses set for submarines and with machine gun ammunition when the bombs were gone. The little ships would not stop, and Kurita on the bridge of his flagship began to doubt what he was seeing. The American ships were too aggressive to be escort carriers. The American aircraft attacked too continuously to be flying from a handful of small decks. The American destroyers charged as if they had a fleet behind them. He decided that they did. He decided that he was in fact fighting Halsey, that the trap had failed, that the fleet carriers of Task Force 38 were somewhere just over the horizon, and that if he continued south into the strait toward Leyte Gulf, he would be caught between them and the American landing force and destroyed. At 9:11 in the morning of the 25th of October, with the transports at Leyte just hours away, Takeo Kurita ordered his fleet to turn north. He was wrong. Halsey was hundreds of miles away, chasing Ozawa's empty carriers. The path to Leyte Gulf was open. Ozawa had done everything asked of him. He had sacrificed his 4 carriers, the last operational carriers in the Japan. He had drawn Halsey away exactly as planned. He had achieved, at ruinous cost, the one thing the show-go plan required, and Kurita had turned away. Ozawa learned of the turn later that day on the bridge of his cruiser as his own force retreated northward from the wreckage of his carriers. He read the message. He did not react outwardly. His officers, watching him closely, saw only the same calm face they had seen when Taiho exploded, when Shokaku sank, when Zukaku's crew sang the anthem beneath a sky full of American bombers. He said nothing for a long time. Then he folded the message and put it in his pocket. By the spring of 1945, the ships were still there. That was the strange thing. If you had walked along the docks at the great naval base at Kuri on the inland sea of Japan, you would have seen aircraft carriers, real ones, Amagi, Katsuragi, Ryuho. Their flight decks were intact, their hulls were painted, their names were still legible on their sterns, but they did not move. They had no fuel to move. The oil of the Dutch East Indies, the reason the war had been fought in the first place, could no longer reach Japan. American submarines had cut the sea lanes. Tankers went out from Sumatra and never came home. The great port of Kuri held a fleet on paper only. The ships sat at their moorings like museum pieces, tied up and waiting. They did not even have aircraft to launch. The pilots were dead. The trained ones, the veterans, the men who had launched from Akagi in December 1941 and from Zuikaka 3 years later were gone. What remained was young men with 50 hours of flight training and orders to fly their aircraft into the sides of America. That was the state of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the summer of 1945. There had been one last operation before the end. In April, the giant battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, had sailed south toward Okinawa with enough fuel for a one-way trip. Her orders were to beach herself on the island and fire her guns until she was destroyed. She never got it. American carrier aircraft found her in the East China Sea and sank her in 2 hours. She went down with more than 3,000 of her crew. There had been no Japanese carrier available to escort her. There were no aircraft available to protect her. She had died alone under a sky full of American planes, and when she went down, she took with her whatever remained of the Navy that Isoroku Yamamoto had built. Yamamoto himself was long dead by then. 2 years earlier, in April 1943, the Americans had killed him. They had killed him with the same weapon they had used to win at Midway. Broken codes. An intercepted message announcing that Yamamoto would be flying to inspect Japanese forces in the northern Solomon. 18 American P-38 Lightning fighters had taken off from Guadalcanal, flown 400 miles at wave-top height to avoid radar, and arrived exactly on time and exactly on target. Yamamoto's aircraft, a G-4M bomber called a Betty by the Americans, had been shot down in the jungle above Bougainville. He had been 59 years old. His body was recovered from the wreckage the following day, still strapped upright in the passenger seat, killed by a bullet through the head before the aircraft hit the ground. His ashes were flown back to Japan. He was given a state funeral. The emperor mourned him. In the passenger compartment of Yamamoto's aircraft that day had been his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Motome Ugaki. Ugaki had survived the crash. Injured, bleeding, thrown from the wreckage, he had been rescued and eventually returned to duty. He had never stopped writing in his diary. Shuichi Nagumo did not survive to see the end. After Midway, he had been quietly removed from carrier command. There was no public disgrace. The Navy did not admit that 4 carriers had been lost. The Japanese people were told that Midway had been a great victory. Nagumo simply disappeared from the news, given lesser assignments, moved farther from the war he had helped begin. By June 1944, he was in command of the naval forces on Saipan in the Mariana. It was a garrison job, a place where careers were sent to end quietly. Then the Americans came. They landed on Saipan on the 15th of June. Nagumo's forces resisted. They were overrun. Within 3 weeks, the island was lost. On the 6th of July 1944, in a cave on the northern end of the island, with the American perimeter closing in and organized resistance ending, Vice Admiral Shuichi Nagumo shot himself in the head with a pistol. He was 57 years old. He left no note. His body was found by American Marines the following day. It was buried in an unmarked grave on Saipan. His family in Japan was not told for many months. 2 years earlier, he had stood on the bridge of Akagi as she burned. He had watched Kaga burn. He had watched Soryu burn. He had abandoned his flagship and stood on the deck of a destroyer and said nothing, as officers around him wondered where the war had gone. Now he was gone too. He had not lived to see the end of what he had begun on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941. Jisaburo Ozawa. After Leyte Gulf, after the loss of his 4 carriers, after Kurita's turn, he had gone home to Japan. There had been nothing left for him to command at sea. The Navy still had ships, technically, but it no longer had a fleet. In May 1945, the government did something strange. It gave him a title, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. The same title Isoroku Yamamoto had held. The same title held by every man who had commanded the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now given to Jisaburo Ozawa, there was no combined fleet. He knew it. Everyone knew it. He accepted the title without ceremony. There were no press announcements, no official photos. He was commander-in-chief of a fleet that could not sail, whose ships had no fuel, whose pilots had no aircraft, whose only mission was to await the American invasion that everyone knew was coming. He was 59 years old. He was, in effect, the last Japanese admiral. When the war ended, he was still holding the title. He surrendered it. He went home. He did not seek employment. He did not seek attention. American investigators from the Strategic Bombing Survey came to interview him about the war. He received them politely and He answered them more honestly than any other Japanese admiral they interviewed. He told them that after the Philippine Sea, the war had been lost. He told them that the Navy. He told them the truth about the pilots, about the fuel, about the impossible plans that had been drawn up at the end when everyone understood the plans could. The Americans found him remarkable. He was, they wrote, a straightforward man. He never wrote a memoir. Others did. Fuchida wrote. Genda wrote. Even Ugaki's diary would eventually be published. But Ozawa refused. When asked in the years after the war why he would not put down his own account, he gave a version of the same answer each time. The defeated, he said, had nothing to say. He lived quietly in Japan for the rest of his life. He died in November 1966, at the age of 80. He was buried without ceremony. The last act of the Imperial Japanese Navy was performed by a man who had been keeping a diary. Motomi Ugaki was 55 years old in August 1945. He commanded the 5th Air Fleet from a base at Kanoya on the southern island of Kyushu. His unit was responsible for organizing the special attack squadrons, the kamikazes. He had watched thousands of young men climb into aircraft they would never bring back. He had signed the orders that sent them. He had toasted them with sake before they left. He had written about them in his diary, each departure, each name, each aircraft type, in the same neat hand he had used since 1941. The diary was called Sensoroku, War Diary. It was a remarkable document. Ugaki wrote in it almost every day for the entire war. When Yamamoto was killed, Ugaki was in the same aircraft. He wrote about it from his hospital. When Midway was lost, he wrote about it from Yamato's operations room. When Leyte failed, he wrote about it from Tokyo. He wrote in the diary about how the Navy would be remembered. He wrote about honor. He wrote about the men who had died. He wrote about how those who survived would have to answer someday for what had been done. 15th of August 1945, at noon, the Emperor of Japan spoke on the radio. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard his voice. He announced that the war was over. He used the phrase that would become famous. The war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan. The emperor ordered his forces to lay down their arms. Otome Ugaki listened to the broadcast at Kanoya. He sat in a room with several of his senior officers. When it was finished, he stood up. He did not speak for a long time. Then he walked to his quarters and changed his uniform. He removed the marks of his rank. He put on a plain flight suit with no insignia. Took from a wooden case a short sword, a tanto. It had been given to him by Isoroku Yamamoto in 1943, shortly before Yamamoto's death. He returned to his headquarters. He gave an order. 11 aircraft were to be readied for a final attack on American forces at Okinawa. His staff resisted. Some of them wept. His junior officers reminded him, some of them shouting, some of them almost begging, that the Emperor had ordered a siege, that further attacks were forbidden, that the war was over, that there was nothing left to fight for. Ugaki did not answer them. He walked to his diary. He wrote a final entry. The war was ending, he wrote, but he had not, he claimed, received official written. And so he wrote he would conduct one final attack on Okinawa, where so many of his young men had died in the preceding. The words he chose were careful. He was writing for history. He knew someone would read the diary. He knew that what he wrote in it would be the record. He wrote that he had not received formal orders to cease operations. It was not true. He had heard the Emperor's broadcast. His staff had confirmed. The official ceasefire orders had reached his headquarters through the chain of command. He knew with absolute clarity that what he was about to do was in defiance of a direct Imperial order. He wrote the lie anyway. Then he closed the diary. He walked out to the flight line. 11 Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers called Judy by the Americans were warming up their engines. The pilots were young. Some of them had trained for only a few weeks. They were standing in ranks beside their aircraft, waiting. When Ugaki approached, he found that there were more men than there were seats. His staff had told him that 11 aircraft would go, meaning 11 pilots, and that he would ride in one of them. But the pilots had heard where he was going. They had come out to the flight line in numbers greater than 11. They wanted to go too. He looked at them. Someone would remember later that his face was very still. He climbed into the second cockpit of the lead aircraft. The pilot in the front seat was Warrant Officer Tatsuo Nakatsu. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 15th of August, 1945, 4 hours after the Emperor's broadcast had told his nation that the war was over, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki led 11 aircraft south from Kanoya toward Okinawa. Radio contact was maintained for some time. At approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, Ugaki sent his final message. He reported that he was diving on an American ship. Then the radio went silent. No wreckage was ever recovered. No American vessel reported an attack that matched his approach. It is possible that his aircraft was shot down over the sea. It is possible that the pilots simply ran out of fuel in the dark. Unable to find a target, unwilling to return home to a nation that had surrendered. It does not matter. He was not coming back. Neither were the young men who had flown with him. The last of them died in the Pacific darkness on the evening of the day the war ended. On the evening of August 15, 1945, while Matome Ugaki was still flying south toward Okinawa, families across America were sitting in their kitchens listening to the radio. In small towns from Maine to California, church bells were ringing. Men who had not slept in 4 years were sleeping. Mothers who had put gold stars in their windows were weeping for sons who would not come home. Fathers were standing on front porches with the newspaper in one hand, trying to find the words to say to their remaining boys that it was over. In Tokyo, an admiral was writing a lie in his diary. In Kanoya, 11 young men were climbing into aircraft that would not come. In Waco, Texas, Ensign George Gay, the only American who had watched Kido Butai burn at Midway, was somewhere quiet with his family, not talking about it. That was the day the Pacific War ended, and nobody who had been there ever really talked about it again. 2 weeks later, on the 2nd of September 1945, the American battleship Missouri entered Tokyo Bay. Her deck was crowded with correspondents, sailors, generals, admirals. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony. A small table had been placed on. 2 documents lay on the table. A Japanese delegation came aboard. There was no Imperial Japanese Navy officer present in an operational capacity. There was no ceremonial. The Navy that had launched from carriers at Pearl Harbor, that had swept across the Pacific for 6 months without defeat, that had fought and died at Midway and the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, was no longer a Navy at all. It was a memory. The Japanese delegation signed the surrender document. The war was over. No Japanese aircraft carrier was operational anywhere in the world. The 4 ships that had made up the Kido Butai on the morning of the 7th of December 1941 lay on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Their bones were scattered across the deep sea north of Midway. The last 4 ships that Ozawa had commanded at Leyte lay on the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The ships at Curie that had never sailed had been bombed at their moorings or would be scrapped. Every Japanese admiral who had commanded a carrier task force at sea between 1941 and 1945 was either dead by his own hand, dead in combat, dead in the crash of his aircraft, or gone home to a country that would never rebuild what had been lost. In 1994, an old man died in Marietta, Georgia. His name was George Gay. He was the last living witness to the sinking of the Japanese carriers at Midway from either side of the battle. Before he died, he asked that his ashes be scattered over the Pacific, at the coordinates where his squadron had been shot down. The Navy did. On the day his ashes were released into the water, they fell into the same sea, at the same latitude, where Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu still lie on the bottom in the dark. Chuichi Nagumo is not there. He is on Saipan. Taman Yamaguchi is with his ship. Isoroku Yamamoto is in Bougainville. Matome Ugaki is somewhere in the sea off Okinawa. But the men they killed and the men they lost are all in the same ocean. The Pacific keeps them together. If you had a father or a grandfather or an uncle who came home from that ocean and never spoke of what he saw there, this was the war he was in. These were the men on the other side. And the reason he did not talk about it for the rest of his life was because there were no words for what he had seen. There were only names and silence and a sea that keeps everything.